All right, here we have John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the third Chief Justice. The first two, John Jay being the very first, had really short tenures. Marshall was the Chief Justice for about 30 years, presided over some very important cases like Marbury versus Madison early in the century. But he also presided over three different cases, three different decisions that are known as the Marshall decisions or the Marshall trilogy that were closely related because they involved Native American rights, essentially. And equally important because, the American system of jurisprudence is based on, it's based on the Constitution, and it is also based on precedent. And these three cases provide the precedent that was the basis for most Supreme Court decisions and most laws about American Indians that have been enacted since this time. Very significant. All right, so we're going to look at the three cases. Two of the three involved Cherokees. The first did not. The first involved a small tribe, Piankanow, I think is how it's pronounced, in Illinois. It's the case Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. And it didn't directly involve Indians. Here's the situation. The Johnson in question had been one of the first members of the Supreme Court when it was established in the 1789. And before that, years before that, back in 1773, 74, Mr. Johnson had bought land in Illinois from that tribe. He had bought the land, his family moved out there, built a house, lived there for decades, for about 50 years, and then along came this guy, McIntosh, who, as per the regulations concerning federal public land, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, as to how to divide up that land in the Northwest Territory, today's Midwest, that had been gained from the British. Thomas Jefferson had come up with the idea of dividing it up into lots and essentially auctioning it off. McIntosh had bought a lot that was there, right there where the Johnson family was, and this led to this court case because McIntosh was saying, I bought this land from the federal government. And then here's these other people claiming they own it. The Johnsons claim, well, we bought this land 50 years ago from the Indians. In this case, the court ruled, and Marshall wrote the opinion explaining this ruling. The court ruled that McIntosh gets the land because Indians don't own land. Here's the argument that Marshall laid out, and he went back to the Spanish and then to the English. He wrote a big long historical piece talking about basically the colonial practices of dealing with Indians, and saying that essentially the doctrine of discovery holds sway. The doctrine of discovery is that if land is not being used, the first person that finds it can lay claim to it. This land was not being used because there was nothing on it but Indians, and Indians don't own land. They're tribal. They have occupancy of the land. In reality, Marshall argued, the land had been claimed first, all of it by the Spanish, and then later in bits and pieces the land there in Illinois claimed by the French, who were then defeated by the English who claimed it, who then were defeated by the United States in the Revolution who claimed it. So the U.S. owns all the land within its borders. And therefore, no individual American citizen has the right to buy land from Indians because of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution that specifically says only Congress can engage in that type of treaty with Indians. Only the federal government. By the way, this is important for reasons beyond Native American rights, because of Marshall's argument that in essence the United States owns all the land within its borders. That's where we get eminent domain, if you've heard of that, which gives the government the right to take your land if they want to use it for some public purpose. They have to pay you for it. They have to pay you a fair price, but they get to decide what the fair price was. Same thing with the Indians. The government owns their land and they can take it. So that's how that case fell out, leading to the idea that, again, doctrine of discovery, Indians don't own land, so Indians can't sell land. Well, that was 1823. At the end of that decade, after Andrew Jackson got elected in 1830, the Indian Removal Act comes along. And at this time, to kind of speed things along, the individual states had started passing laws that affected the Indian nations living within their states. Georgia, for example. Georgia passed a bunch of laws that refused to recognize the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation because they were inside the borders of Georgia, and Georgia is a sovereign state, and they control everything within their border. So Georgia passed laws in which anything the Cherokee Nation wanted to do differently didn't count. One of the laws was, for example, that that non-Indian people who want to live in Indian country have to get a license. They have to get permission from the Georgia state government to do so. Now, why would they do that? The real reasoning there was to keep the missionaries out, because the people of Georgia, especially the political leaders, believed those missionaries were the ones giving the Cherokees all these ideas about, their rights and stuff. Well, the Cherokee Nation, presided over again by Principal Chief John Ross, hired lawyers. They hired lawyers and sued the state of Georgia, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. When it got there, the court ruled, and again, Marshall wrote the decision. The court ruled that essentially the whole thing is moot because Indian tribes can't sue a state. Indian tribes can't sue anybody because they're not really political entities. And here, Marshall went into more historical detail and essentially said that Indian tribes, while they are described as nations in treaties, are not independent nations. They are rather dependent nations. And he compared their situation to that of a ward to their legal guardian. So a ward, that's when you've got someone who is not of legal age, let's say a teenager, or could be younger than that. They're not adopted, but they don't have parents, and for some reason another family has legal say to make the legal decisions about them, and that's granted to them by the court. And so all the main decisions are made by the guardian. Now, just as an example of this, my wife and I took in a foster child a few years ago from Mississippi, actually. a troubled teenager with a really bad family life, and we became her legal guardians. So she wasn't adopted. We weren't her adopted parents, but we did make all the decisions about money, finances, health, education, all that stuff. So he's saying that's what Indian tribes are like wards. They're like foster children, not adopted children or natural children. They're foster children who can't make their own decisions because they're not capable of it. So therefore, even though they have a form of tribal government and a form of nationhood and dependence, ultimately they are wards of the federal government. And as such, cannot sue the state of Georgia, so it doesn't really matter. Now, Marshall was kind of sympathetic to their cause, but looking at it strictly from a legal standpoint, the court decided, that there was no legal basis to even hear the case. Well, what did the Cherokee Nation do? They got someone involved who was not a ward of the state. Remember I said that part of the reason for doing this was to keep the missionaries out. A lot of missionaries were living there. The Cherokees had invited them in so they would open schools, right? Those missionaries refused to leave Cherokee land and refused to apply for permission from the state of Georgia to be there, which broke this Georgia state law. And so the missionaries were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to hard labor in prison. The principal one, I think there were three. I know that there were several, but the principal one was Samuel Worcester of Massachusetts, a Congregationalist, formerly known as Puritans. He brings suit against the state of Georgia using the same lawyers as the Cherokees and really in conjunction with the Cherokee Nation. But the Supreme Court ruled they couldn't hear anything from the Cherokee Nation. They can hear from an American citizen, which is what Worcester was. So the claim was Georgia had no authority to pass laws regarding Indian tribes, that was unconstitutional. Again, the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, only the federal government and specifically the U.S. Congress can pass laws about Indians. And this time the Cherokees and their white ally Worcester won. They won the case. The Supreme Court ruled, and Marshall explained that yes, it was unconstitutional for the state of Georgia to pass any laws regulating Indians. Only the federal government can do that. So all those laws that Georgia had passed trying to squeeze the Cherokees out of the state, trying to force them into removal, were unconstitutional and could not stand. All right. Well, famously, the response to that from the federal government, and of course who's in charge of the federal government, the chief executive, Andrew Jackson, was reputed to have said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. End quote. Now, we don't know that he said those exact words, but we do have letters he wrote in which he essentially said the same thing. Mr. Marshall's made this decision, but I'm not going to enforce it. Let him enforce it. Well, the judicial branch did not have the means to enforce laws. Now, the U.S. Marshal Service is attached to the judicial branch, and they can go out and arrest fugitives or people who have been summoned to court, but they can't enforce laws outside of that. It's the job of the executive branch to enforce the laws. That's what they are for. But President Jackson refused to do so, which meant that those Georgia laws, even though they were unconstitutional, stood, and the tension rose ever more to try to force the Cherokees off their land. Now we will talk a little bit about the divisions among the Cherokee. I talked before about how each of these tribes had two factions. One faction that tended to be modernist, that wanted to take the deal and sign over the land and accept the new land in Oklahoma. And another faction that tended to be the traditionalist, that tended to be the majority, and that tended to be the official tribal government, who refused to sign over their land and whose goal was to stay on their land and live the way they lived. Among the Cherokees, this led to these two factions being referred to as two different political parties, essentially. The National Party, which was the one that held control. The principal chief, John Ross, member of the National Party. By the way, John Ross was also named Gooiskooey, Cherokee for white bird, was 7/8 Scottish, but because Cherokees are matrilineal, it's still considered full Cherokee. You're either in the tribe or you're not. Anyway, so this thing about the biracial people tending to be pro-removal, it's true in the numbers that was the tendency, but it didn't always work out that way. So John Ross, as well as the majority of the tribal council, were against removal. Eventually, one of Ross's former allies and a very prominent person in the Cherokee Nation named Major Ridge led the opposition in favor of signing the treaty and taking the other land in Oklahoma. Major Ridge, formerly known as the Ridge, had been a Chickamauga. He had been out there with Dragging Canoe in the 1780s and 1790s, fighting against settlers in Tennessee. He started calling himself Major Ridge after the Creek War, when he had led Cherokee forces in alliance with Andrew Jackson. So he is a prominent leader of the group that wants to sign the treaty, and so are several members of his family. His son, John Ridge, and his nephew, Elias Boudinot, who had been born Buck Waddy. Boudinot and Ridge had both been sent to what is now Dartmouth University to get an education. And then Elias Boudinot's brother, Stand Waddy. So Ridge, his son, and his two nephews were the principal leaders of this faction. But there were others, members of the Starr family, for example. And what happened was very similar to what happened with the Choctaws. If you'll remember, federal government came. The majority of Choctaws didn't want to sell the land, but the ones who did want to sell, the federal government talked to them separately and accepted their signatures as standing for the whole tribe. And that's what happened with the Treaty Party, also called the Ridge Party. These were also called the Ross Party and the Ridge Party. Ridge, his son and nephews, and others signed this treaty at New Echota, which was the Cherokee capital in northern Georgia. Signed this treaty, signing over all Cherokee lands, despite the fact that Ridge was not principal chief, Ross was, and that they didn't have the approval of the National Council or a referendum of the Cherokee people, the majority of whom were opposed to this treaty. But the U.S. government took it. They took it, and it was approved in Congress, and in 1836, the Cherokee people were informed, this treaty sticks, this treaty is valid, you have 2 years to leave on your own. And if you don't leave on your own within 2 years, then we will make you leave. Now, the Ridge family went ahead right at this point, 1836, took the land, and there was some money involved too, I think, and they moved on out to Oklahoma, where they joined with some of the Cherokees who had moved out there earlier, like in the 18 teens and earlier in the 1820s. Ross and the majority of the Cherokee people stayed in their homeland and continued to fight this thing in the courts, dragging it through the court and essentially, really hoping to keep it tied up in court until after 1836. The end of November 1836 was going to be the next presidential election. It was the end of Andrew Jackson's second term, so he wouldn't be running for a third term. And they were hoping that if they could, if they could keep it tied up until the election, and the Democrats, which was what Jackson was, lost, and the Whigs won, maybe a Whig government would let them out of this what they viewed as a fake treaty. But it didn't work because Andrew Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, won, and he carried out Jackson's policies. Now, all these tribes were given this basic essential choice. You say you want to remain in your homeland. You may do that, but if you do, you must renounce your tribal identity and become an official citizen of the state in which you live, so you no longer have any tribal rights or tribal recognition. You're just like everybody else. Your tribe no longer will exist in this state. But if you want to keep your tribal identity, that's okay too, but go somewhere else to do it. Now this was kind of a fake promise, because the small number of people who took that deal, agreed to stay and become citizens, usually didn't get to become citizens anyway. Now, in some cases, prominent people like Greenwood LaFleur, the Choctaw leader, did. The vast majority still, however, didn't want to leave. And you'll recall that by 1836, we talked about this last time, there were still Creeks remaining, and they started to essentially fight back against the settlers who had been attacking them, and so that triggered their removal. 1838, federal troops were sent to Tennessee to help initiate removal of the Cherokees to Indian Territory, which was the name for what is now Oklahoma. So one way or another, all 5 tribes were removed to this area, and you can see there in the light green, that's their new home, their new homeland in Oklahoma. And then in the dark green, their traditional, what was left of their traditional homelands. I showed you that last time, that map that showed all of their traditional homeland. This is what they had left by the 1830s. For the Choctaws, when they signed off in 1830 and were removed, they were sent by steamboat. So were the Creeks, so were the Chickasaws. The Seminoles, we'll talk about in a moment, they resisted. Cherokees, however, started to be rounded up in May of 1838 in what is now Chattanooga at Ross's Landing. They were put in pens, wooden stockades, for months over the summer until everyone could be gathered up. And then they were forced to march. In fall, they started the long walk to Oklahoma, which meant they had to walk through the winter in what has become known as the Trail of Tears. Now, the Cherokee Nation, the Creek Nation, and the Choctaw Nation each had roughly about 20,000 members. Chickasaws and Seminoles were smaller. They had roughly about 8,000 apiece. All 5 of those tribes eventually, 90% of them were removed. About 10% of each tribe managed, by one means or another, to avoid being rounded up and stayed in their homeland, and their descendants are still there, but 90% were forced to remove. On the Trail of Tears, the Cherokees lost about 1/4 of their number that were on that march, dead of disease, starvation, or most often exposure from the cold. John Ross's wife, by the way, this is a picture of him later in life in the 1860s. His wife was one of those who died. She gave away her blankets to children to save them, and she died. Now, the other tribes were not forced to walk the whole way, but they still suffered large losses. The Choctaw, remember, they were moved by steamboat, and they were all moved to Memphis first, where they were put in stockades for months with very poor, little to no sanitation, and cholera broke out and killed about 1/4 of them. The Creeks were in a similar situation in New Orleans. About 1/4 of them died. All 5 tribes lost about 25% of their number in the removal process. Now, one thing that most folks aren't aware of or lose sight of is the fact that, as we discussed earlier, the U.S. government early on was trying to, quote-unquote, teach these tribes how to be good Americans and how to be good farmers, despite the fact that they were already farmers. And that involved them adopting plantation slavery. So many of the Indians we're talking about, Cherokees, Creeks, and etc., had slaves of African descent. So on the Trail of Tears, there were a large number of slaves who were on that march as well. Well, that was the Cherokees. Going to talk just a little bit about the situation with the Choctaws. We've been talking about the 5 civilized tribes, Indian removal, and the Trail of Tears. This guy is not a member of the 5 civilized tribes, nor is he an American citizen. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and he was from France. He was in the United States in the 1820s and 1830s, actually on a mission for the French government to go and examine American penitentiaries and write a report on it to see whether that France wanted to use that penitentiary system. But he wound up writing kind of a travel book about his experiences in the U.S., in which he explained to his European readers back home what America was like and what Americans were like. He happened to be in Memphis when the Choctaws were put on those steamboats after having been in those stockades for a while, and others having just recently arrived from being marched up from Mississippi. He was present to see that whole process. So they were all loaded on these many steamboats and sent off the river toward Oklahoma. And he noted that when they had gone to Memphis, they had taken their dogs with them. But the government wouldn't let the dogs on the steamboats. So as the steamboats were pulling away, there were hundreds of howling, baying dogs paddling out into the water, trying to catch the boats, trying to reach their masters in vain, which is a poignant story for dog lovers. And also, I mean, it's the sort of thing that shows you just how real this was. That when you talk about the large number of people who died, which is really worse, worse by far than dogs becoming strayed. It's just a bunch of numbers, and it's hard to attach faces to it. But this demonstrates just how traumatic the process was. Something else that demonstrates the trauma of the process is the words of George Harkins, who had taken over as one of those three principal chiefs of the Choctaws. And this is a press release, essentially, that he gave upon removal, upon the embarking from Memphis. He said, "Friends, my attachment to my native land was strong. That cord is now broken, and we must go forth as wanderers in a strange land. We go forth sorrowful, knowing that wrong has been done. Here is the land of our progenitors, our ancestors, and here are their bones. They left them as a sacred deposit, and we have been compelled to venerate its trust. It is dear to us, yet we cannot stay. My people are dear to me. With them I must go." Now, when we think about the trauma of the Trail of Tears, as non-native people, we tend to focus on two things. Number one, all those people that died. That's terrible. Number two, the loss of their land, which is also terrible. But we forget about some of the other things that happened, some of the other trauma that this involved. Like, for example, as Harkins is pointing out, it's not just the fact that's their land, because they didn't think of themselves as owning it anyway. It was the fact that this is the land where their parents were buried, their grandparents were buried, and it was their duty to watch over the bones of their parents, their grandparents. And if that sounds a little odd or macabre, it's not really if you think of it in context of the South in general. My mom in particular, she loves cemeteries because that's where all her family is. She makes sure that there's flowers. She makes sure that the mowing is done right. She is the caretaker of the legacy of her family. And that's how George Harkins and others viewed it. And they were being torn away, not just from their homeland, but literally from their ancestors. The whole sense of identity of these native tribes was centered primarily on kinship and secondarily on place, even if they didn't view land as something people could own. They still viewed themselves as deeply, deeply attached to it. Another thing that people forget about: sacred sites. Every one of these tribes had holy places that were deeply important to their spiritual center, to their worship, that they were taken away from. Something else you forget about is the change in environment. If you've ever been to the Smoky Mountains, and then you've been to Oklahoma, you might have noticed that Oklahoma is not the Smoky Mountains. It's very different. In addition to being less lush and mountainous, there's a whole different set of animals. There's a whole different set of plants. Now, the Cherokees had centuries to learn all the ins and outs of the flora and fauna, to know the habits of all the animals, to know which herbs and plants were good for helping which diseases. Now they got to start completely fresh someplace else. Now, as I said, a small minority did get to remain behind, about 10%. And how that happened, especially with the Cherokees, is a very interesting story that I don't really have time to go into in as much depth as I would like here. I do in some of my other classes. But It's important to realize we're talking about Indian removal. I hope you've picked up on this. Everyone connects it with the Cherokees. But it wasn't just the Cherokees. It was the 5 civilized tribes. So there's 4 more tribes. But it wasn't just the 5 civilized tribes. It was tribes east of the Mississippi. There were other fairly large southern tribes like the Catawba in the Carolinas, like the Natchez in Louisiana that were removed. And there were some groups that were removed from northern areas in the Midwest. Not as many, because remember I said that this Indian Removal Act passed Congress, but not overwhelmingly. That's because it was overwhelmingly supported in the South, but mostly opposed in the North. Most Northerners viewed it as cruel and un-American. Most Southerners wanted that land. So Southerners would frequently say, when someone, say, from New England criticized them for being cruel, for removing these Indians, they would frequently say, well, that's nice for you to say, Massachusetts. Where are your Indians now? Most of them were gone. There was a small number of Southern politicians, not very many at all, who opposed this. One of them was Davy Crockett, congressman from Tennessee, one of the only Southern members of the House to oppose Andrew Jackson's policy. And in the South, that was career suicide. And when someone asked him, don't you realize that you're going to have to face your voters? Because the voters wanted the land. Remember when I talked earlier about how after the American Revolution, Indians were in a bad spot because the people who made the decisions had to be elected by the people who want the Indians' land. So Crockett was asked, don't you know you have to face your voters? And he responded, I have to face myself in the mirror. One day I'll have to face God. So no matter what happened later at the Alamo, this is why I've always regarded Davy Crockett as being heroic in this particular instance, because he did sacrifice his political career. Most people in the South didn't do that. Okay, well, wasn't even just Southern Indians, like I said. Up in the Midwest, the Sauk and Fox tribes, allied tribes who lived in northern Illinois and Wisconsin, they had signed off on a treaty that basically was going to empower the government to ask them to move back in the 18 teens, and may not have completely understood the significance of that, but no one acted on it until the early 1830s, when all the tribes were being removed. Then they were told that they were going to have to leave their homeland and be removed, and they resisted, led by Chief Black Hawk in what is known as Black Hawk's War, mostly up there in the Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin area. A short war, significant because, well, it led to the Sauk and Fox being removed to eventually Oklahoma. And if you've ever heard of Jim Thorpe, who was overwhelmingly voted the greatest athlete of the 20th century, he was from that tribe, from Oklahoma. He was a descendant of the people who had fought in this war to try to stay in their homeland. Young militia officer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln was in this war, but spent most of the time with diarrhea, didn't see combat. Black Hawk himself became the first Native American to write his own autobiography, which was a big hit and really interesting reading. But they got removed as well. All right, well, I said we would come back to the Seminoles. They were very much opposed to the idea of leaving their homeland, and they had an advantage over the other four civilized tribes. They had an environmental advantage because they were there in the very swampy area of Florida, and it was a lot harder to round them up if they didn't want to be rounded up. And they fought back. And they fought back for 7 years. The Second Seminole War. This painting is a painting of Seminoles about to attack a group of U.S. Marines led by a young officer named Dade, whom the Seminoles wiped out. Dade County, Dade County, Florida, where Miami is, was named for this guy. Here are some of the principal leaders of the Seminole in this war, from left to right. Micanopy, who was the principal chief, Osceola, who had become the most famous, and John Horse, or Juan Caballo in Spanish. As they used to say on Sesame Street, one of these is not like the others. John Horse, you'll notice, is a black guy. He was, I believe his father had been a slave who had run away and been accepted into the Seminoles. And so he was part of that group that's known as the Black Seminoles. Osceola had a wife who was a runaway slave. This is one of the things that was a point of contention in this war. The U.S. government wanted all the runaway slaves returned. Seminoles refused to do it. Osceola was one of those people who made the mistake of coming in under a flag of truce to negotiate. That happens a lot in U.S. history if you're not white. He wound up being murdered, and his head was pickled and passed around at county fairs for decades. John Horse led the Black Seminoles in an alliance with the regular Seminoles. See, some of the Black Seminoles had their own towns, and others were just like interspersed among the other Seminoles. Eventually, by the way, John Horse was captured, and he and his people were sent to Oklahoma. That's what happened whenever any of these Seminoles were captured. They'd be shipped off to Indian Territory. And from Oklahoma, John Horse's Black Seminoles left and went down to Mexico and served the Mexican government as scouts for a long time. It was during the Seminole War that this American general came into prominence, Zachary Taylor, alias Old Rough and Ready. And looking at him right here, he looks pretty rough. I'm not sure if he looks ready. But he was able to parlay the fame he got from this into later becoming President of the United States, not unlike the commanding general in the First Seminole War, Andrew Jackson. So, by the 1840s, or by the year 1840, here was the situation in Oklahoma. Perhaps you recognize the shape of that future state. You can see where the Choctaw Nation was, the Cherokee Nation, the Creek Nation, Seminoles, and Chickasaws. Over in the western end, some of the Plains tribes, like the Kiowa and the Comanche, were still active there. The Cherokee Outlet was an area that was supposed to enable Cherokees to get farther out into the plains to hunt buffalo if they wanted to, also known as the Cherokee Strip. When the Cherokees got there, at the end of that forced march, remember, the Ridge Party had signed that treaty, and they had gone out here early. Things did not go well when you've got the people that had signed the treaty and then the people who had lost 1/4 of their family members being forced to walk after losing their land. So, remember what happened to William McIntosh, the Creek leader who had signed that treaty with the Creek land? That's what happened to Major Ridge and his son John Ridge and his nephew Elias Boudinot. Almost happened to his nephew Stan Waddy, but he was able to get away to live to fight another day. And there was just a lot of fighting for several years through the 1840s among the Cherokees, with the bitter, bitter feeling that they had and the division among them. Meanwhile, once the Indians were removed from the South, all of a sudden, in the South, Indians were romanticized as being great heroes. Here's Pushmataha that I mentioned earlier in his uniform that he wore when he was allied with Andrew Jackson in the Creek War. School textbooks started to talk about how wonderful and heroic Cherokees were once they were gone, most of them. And it was around this time that white people all started to have a Cherokee grandmother, or at least to think they did, because that gave them a feeling of authenticity. Usually wasn't true. And with this being done, now all that land was open and available in the Deep South for cotton agriculture to expand and for slavery to expand. And kind of an interesting side effect of all this that no one would have anticipated, the arguments that states made against the federal government when it came to Indians, states arguing they had rights and the federal government shouldn't interfere with what they did in their state. Those same arguments would be used a few years later to justify seceding from the Union to protect slavery. So Indian removal was really, in some ways, like I say, most people would never think about this, setting the stage for the Civil War by removing the Indians and allowing the expansion of slavery, and by giving those states kind of a practice run on fighting against the federal government.